As the rain pounds against the funeral parlor windows, Emily Harrington, 41, clutches the folded flag from her late husband Richard's casket. A loving father and admired community leader, Richard's sudden death has left a void in their lives. But when the family solicitor begins reading the will, Emily's world shatters. Not a single mention of her name. Instead, Richard leaves everything to their 2 teenage children and a mysterious woman, his assistant, Sarah Blake. Grief turns to rage and confusion as Emily confronts the haunting question: did Richard know her darkest secrets? The overcast sky mirrored the mood as Emily Harrington clutched her son Ethan's hand, her daughter Lila leaning against her side for support. The funeral was a blur of tearful embraces and murmured condolences, the kind that made Emily feel as if she were floating above her own life, watching it crumble. Richard's sudden death at 44 had left her reeling. He wasn't just her husband, he was her anchor, the one who held the family together with his unwavering kindness and dedication. But grief turned to disbelief mere hours later in Jack Montgomery's polished office. Seated in the leather armchair across from the family solicitor, Emily braced herself as Jack began reading Richard's will. At first, it was standard fare mentions of the children's trust funds and sentimental items for relatives. Then came the words that made Emily's stomach churn. To Sarah Blake, my personal assistant, I leave my investments, amounting to $100,000, and my share of the family home. Emily's grip tightened on the chair's armrest, her mind racing. Sarah Blake? The young, vivacious assistant who Richard had always claimed was just a work colleague? Emily barely heard the rest of the will, which left everything else to Ethan and Lila. Not a single mention of her Richard's wife of 15 years. The silence in the room was deafening. Emily's heart pounded as Jack closed the document. Her children looked too stunned to react, but Emily's thoughts were a storm. Had Richard known something? Had their marriage been built on a lie she wasn't even aware of? The betrayal stung like a fresh wound, and as the room emptied, Emily was left alone with the questions swirling in her mind. Who was Sarah Blake to Richard, really? And why had he erased Emily from his final testament? Hours later, Emily found herself sitting on the edge of their bed, staring at the box of keepsakes she'd hidden away years ago. Richard's watch, a photo of their honeymoon in Paris, and the cards he'd written her on anniversaries. They felt like artifacts from another lifetime. How could the man who had once declared his undying love for her have kept such a monumental secret? She couldn't stop thinking about Sarah Blake. Sarah was everything Emily hadn't been in years: young, confident, and full of life. Richard had spent countless late nights at the office, and though Emily had questioned it, she never truly doubted him. But now, the pieces seemed to fit together too perfectly. Yet there was another layer to the betrayal that Emily couldn't ignore: her own guilt. For years, she had carried the weight of her infidelities. Richard had never confronted her, but had he known all along? The possibility sent a shiver down her spine. If he had known, did he write her out of his will as punishment? Emily's thoughts grew darker. Sarah wasn't just a convenient scapegoat, she was a mystery Emily needed to unravel. The next day, she began searching through Richard's belongings, looking for anything that could explain the connection. As she combed through his desk drawers and old files, she came across a receipt for an expensive necklace, one she'd never seen. Her breath hitched. Had Richard bought this for Sarah? Was this his way of showing her the love Emily had failed to give him? The questions clawed at her, and Emily knew there was no going back. She had to uncover the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Emily's world had been upended, but the gnawing need for answers drove her forward. The necklace receipt she'd found lingered in her mind. It wasn't just an oversight or a forgotten gift, it felt like proof of something deeper, something Richard had hidden from her. She decided to dig further, her emotions oscillating between anger, guilt, and desperation. Her first stop was Richard's email account. She hadn't looked at it in years. They'd trusted each other, or so she'd thought. As she scrolled through endless messages about work and community projects, she finally stumbled upon emails exchanged with Sarah Blake. At first glance, they seemed professional discussions about schedules, meetings, and client updates. But as Emily read further, the tone shifted. There were inside jokes, compliments about Sarah's bright ideas and messages sent late at night. Emily's heart sank when she found one from 2 months before Richard's death. "Thank you for being my rock during this difficult time. I don't know how I'd manage without you." Emily stared at the screen, her mind spinning. Difficult time? What was Richard referring to? And why hadn't he turned to her instead? She printed the emails, her hands trembling. The feeling of betrayal deepened, and yet she couldn't ignore the irony of her own actions. For years, she had sought comfort outside their marriage. Was this Richard's way of doing the same? Determined to find Sarah, Emily called Jack Montgomery the next day under the pretense of needing financial details. Casually, she asked about Sarah Blake. Jack hesitated but eventually revealed that Sarah had taken a leave of absence after Richard's death. Emily's pulse quickened. Why? Was Sarah mourning Richard in her own way? Emily's search for answers had only just begun, and each revelation pulled her deeper into a web of deceit and regret. Emily's pursuit of the truth wasn't just about Richard anymore, it was about facing herself. The emails had cracked open a door she'd kept firmly shut, her own history of infidelity. For years, she had justified her choices, convincing herself that Richard's emotional distance gave her no other option. But now, sitting in their quiet house surrounded by memories of him, those justifications felt hollow. She thought back to her first affair, a fleeting romance with a charming coworker named Michael. It had been thrilling at the time, a spark in the monotony of married life. But Michael had moved on quickly, leaving Emily to pick up the pieces of her guilt. Then came Daniel, a friend of the family. That relationship had been more emotional than physical, and it had nearly unraveled everything. Emily's heart sank as she remembered how Richard had seemed to retreat further into himself during those years. Had he known? His silence on the matter had always confused her. Perhaps he'd chosen to forgive her without ever confronting her, or perhaps he'd found solace elsewhere with Sarah. As she sat in their living room, flipping through old photo albums, Emily felt the weight of her past crashing down on her. For every smiling picture of their family, there was a memory of a moment she'd betrayed Richard. And now, with the will's revelations, it seemed that he'd left his own response silent, yet devastating. Emily knew she couldn't run from her past anymore. If she was going to find out the truth about Sarah and Richard, she'd also have to confront her own choices. But would she be able to handle the answers? Emily's search led her to Sarah Blake's modest apartment in the heart of the city. Standing outside the door, she hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. What if Sarah confirmed her worst fears? What if Richard had loved her in ways he hadn't loved Emily for years? Sarah opened the door cautiously, her face pale and tired. "Mrs. Harrington," she asked, her voice soft. Emily nodded, struggling to keep her emotions in check. They sat down in Sarah's small living room, an awkward silence hanging between them before Emily finally blurted, "I need to know the truth about you and my husband." Sarah looked away, her expression pained. "Richard and I were close," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But not in the way you think." Emily frowned, her anger flaring. "Then why did he leave you so much in his will? Why didn't he leave anything to me?" Sarah hesitated before responding. "Richard was helping me pay off medical bills. My mother is sick, and he wanted to make sure I was taken care of after he was gone." She paused, tears welling in her eyes. "And as for leaving you out, he thought you didn't need anything. He believed you'd be fine without him." Emily sat back, stunned. Was this the truth, or was Sarah playing a game to protect herself? Either way, Emily felt no closer to understanding the man she'd shared her life with, or the reasons behind his final decisions. Emily returned home after her confrontation with Sarah, her mind a whirlwind of questions. She sat at Richard's desk, opening drawers she had never bothered to explore during their marriage. Among the mundane paperwork, bills, tax documents, and receipts, she found a small, worn journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it, unsure of what she might find. The pages revealed a side of Richard she had never seen before. His handwriting, neat but hurried, chronicled his thoughts over the years. The first entries were mundane, focusing on work stress and family joys, but as she read on, the tone shifted. Sometimes I feel like I'm failing Emily and the kids. I don't know how to be enough for her anymore." Emily's heart tightened at the words. Had Richard known about her infidelities all along? As she continued reading, she came across an entry written just months before his death. "I've tried to forgive her, but the pain lingers. Maybe I deserve this for my own shortcomings. Sarah says forgiveness is freeing, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to let go." Emily froze. Sarah had been more than just his assistant, she had been his confidante. Richard's journal painted a picture of a man who had silently endured pain, choosing not to confront her betrayals but instead burying them deep within himself. But there was another layer, one she hadn't anticipated. Richard had written about his own struggles with intimacy, acknowledging that it might have driven her away. He had blamed himself for their fractured marriage, even as he tried to maintain a facade of normalcy for their children. Emily realized she hadn't just lost her husband, she had lost the chance to truly understand him. The journal left her with more questions than answers, and an overwhelming sense of guilt settled over her. Just as Emily was beginning to piece together the fragments of Richard's hidden life, Jack Montgomery called. His voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. "Emily, I found something else. A letter Richard asked me to give you, but only after the will was read." Emily's breath caught. "A letter? From Richard?" She agreed to meet Jack at his office the next morning, her mind racing with possibilities. Was this a confession, an apology, or another revelation that would cut even deeper? When Jack handed her the envelope, her hands shook as she opened it. Richard's familiar handwriting greeted her, and her eyes welled with tears as she began to read. "Emily, if you're reading this, I'm no longer there to answer your questions, but I felt it was only fair to leave you with the truth. I've known about your affairs for years. At first, I was angrier than I thought I could ever be. But then I realized something: we both failed each other. My distance pushed you away, just as your actions pushed me into silence." Emily gasped, her eyes darting over the words. The letter continued. "Sarah wasn't what you think. She was someone who reminded me that kindness still existed in the world, but my love for her was never romantic. It was a refuge, a way to survive the pain. I didn't leave you out of the will to hurt you. I wanted you to reflect on the life we built, the choices we made, and the legacy we leave behind. You'll always have my love, even if we couldn't find a way back to each other." The letter ended with a simple plea. "Forgive me for not being the man you needed. And if you can, forgive yourself too." Emily broke down, tears streaming as she clutched the letter. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was the answer she needed. Richard's final words forced her to confront her own role in their fractured marriage and the guilt she had carried for so long. As Emily absorbed the revelations in Richard's letter, she realized that the gulf between her and her children had grown wider since his passing. Jason and Lily, once her closest confidants, now seemed like distant strangers. They avoided conversations with her, their words clipped and guarded. Emily couldn't ignore the truth any longer. They blamed her for something, though she wasn't sure exactly what. One evening, she gathered the courage to confront them. They sat in the living room, their father's favorite space, surrounded by the echoes of memories. Jason, at 19, looked every bit the man his father had been, while Lily, at 16, still clung to the edges of childhood. "Why are you shutting me out?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. Jason's expression hardened. "Because we know, Mom. About you and those other men." Emily felt the air leave her lungs. "How?" Dad knew, Jason said bitterly. "He tried to keep it from us, but we're not stupid. We saw the cracks. We heard the arguments you thought we didn't notice." Lily chimed in, her voice breaking. "You hurt him, Mom. He deserved better than this." Emily was devastated. "I made mistakes, terrible ones, but I loved your father. I never stopped loving him." Jason stood, his face a mix of anger and pain. "If you loved him, you wouldn't have betrayed him. You need to figure out who you are without dragging us into your mess." Their words hit her like a tidal wave, leaving her emotionally adrift. For the first time, Emily saw herself through their eyes not as their mother, but as someone who had shattered the foundation of their family. The confrontation with her children left Emily reeling. She realized that apologies alone wouldn't heal the wounds she had caused. She needed to take action not to win back their affection, but to rebuild herself into someone they could respect again. Emily decided to meet with Sarah once more. This time it wasn't about seeking answers, it was about making peace. She called Sarah and requested a meeting at a quiet cafe. When they sat down, Emily spoke first. "I want to thank you for being there for Richard when I couldn't. He trusted you in ways he couldn't trust me, and I understand why now." Sarah seemed taken aback by the admission. "Emily, I didn't mean to replace you. Richard loved you, even when things were difficult." Emily nodded. "I know, but I need to understand. Why did he leave me out of the will?" Sarah hesitated before responding. "Richard wanted you to find your own path, to confront your choices and figure out who you are. He wasn't punishing you, he was giving you a chance to rebuild." The conversation was bittersweet but cathartic. Emily left with a renewed sense of purpose. She began volunteering at local charities, throwing herself into helping others as a way to atone for her mistakes. Slowly, she started to find fragments of herself that she had lost over the years. Months passed, and Emily's life started to take on new meaning. Though her relationship with Jason and Lily was still strained, there were small signs of healing. Jason surprised her one afternoon by visiting her at a soup kitchen where she was volunteering. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, watching her hand out meals to the homeless. Emily smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Because I need to be better, Jason. For you, for Lily, and for myself." Jason didn't respond, but the fact that he stayed and helped for the rest of the afternoon gave her hope. Meanwhile, Emily began to rediscover her own passions: painting, something she had abandoned years ago. She poured her emotions onto canvas, creating pieces that reflected her grief, guilt, and the faint glimmers of hope she was beginning to feel. One evening, as she prepared for her first art exhibit, she found herself standing before a portrait of Richard. It was his face, rendered from memory, but the eyes captured the mix of pain and love she had finally come to understand. At the exhibit, Jason and Lily arrived unexpectedly. They stood before the portrait, silent but visibly moved. Lily reached for her mother's hand, and Jason gave her a nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. As the night ended, Emily felt a sense of closure. Richard's love, his pain, and even his death had shaped her, but they no longer defined her. She was ready to embrace a future built on honesty and self-discovery. Thank you for watching Emily's journey. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and comment below. And subscribe to our channel for more stories about life, love, and redemption.